Hi, everyone. It's the top of the hour. Once again, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy days to spend just an hour with the American Red Cross and listen to us on this important topic. So we're still going to have some people filter in. I want to let you know that video and audio for all participants is disabled. We are recording this presentation, but nobody can hear you, nobody can see you while you're on this. And if you have a question, you're able to chat with our moderators. You can post a question into the Q&A, and I encourage you to do so. We'll have some of those selected questions as we have time at the end that we'll answer. I also want to encourage you, there'll be a couple interactive portions of this, interactive in a different way. I'll instruct you to go take your cell phone, or you can use any kind of device that you have, and go to a website, menti.com. And then you'll enter a code and you'll be able to participate in these two interactive portions. I'll give you more specific directions when we get there. Very, very easy, and I think it'll enhance the experience here. So without further ado, I want to welcome you to the American Red Cross presentation on International Humanitarian Law on the Frontlines. Before we get started, I promised an interactive portion. So before we dive into the meat of things, I want the audience here to go to menti.com. It's up there at the top of the screen, menti.com. And you're going to enter that code, the numerical code that you see at the top there, 47372963. It's right there at the top of your screen. You're going to go there, and I want you to type in whatever first word that comes to mind, first couple words, 3 words, when you hear the phrase or the term International Humanitarian Law. Go ahead and go to menti.com, and it should, as people start to input their answers here, we'll start to see them populate. There we go. Accountability, protection, fairness, rules of war. Okay, excellent. You can participate. Go up to menti.com and enter that code in, 47372963. Peacemakers, universality, regulation. These are great. POW. I assume that's POW, not POW. Care, caring, consequences. This is outstanding. You're in the right place. This word bubble can't keep up with all these great answers. There's 400 people in this webinar right now, so this is a fantastic word bubble. Justice, ICRC, outstanding. On behalf of the American Red Cross, welcome. I want to introduce you just very briefly to our team and some of the folks that you'll be hearing from today. The Senior Director for International Services U.S. Programs, Randy Bagwell, couldn't be with us today. Maybe he's in the audience somewhere, but he's out at Camp Zama, Japan, several hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time here. It's the middle of the night for him. Randy's our intrepid leader. Randy and I go back a number of years. He was my first boss on active duty when I was a young lieutenant and judge advocate. And I'm very privileged to serve under him now and have brought my career back full circle under an outstanding leader like him. My name is Thomas Harper. I'm the Senior Legal Advisor in IHL for the American Red Cross. It's my privilege to work alongside both Christian Jorgensen and Larissa Hatch, as well as our 2 current IHL fellows, Eric Schmitz and Samantha Sham, who are not pictured on this slide today. Christian Jorgensen, as you can see, serves as our legal advisor, and you'll be hearing from him in just a bit. And Larissa Hatch is our program officer. She's the smart one of the bunch that did not go to law school, so she's made the right decisions in life. But she heads up and is a great leader for our IHL Youth Action campaign. And you'll hear from her very shortly. Our next interactive portion in just a moment is going to be preceded by this image. And I'll set the table by describing to you a couple basics about this image to know. So what you're looking at in this hypothetical situation is a residential building. Apartments are found up and down this building. It was occupied at the time that it was struck in a military attack, causing severe damage there. several civilians, several residents inside this building were killed during this attack. Now, we're going to go back to menti.com. And I gave you some basics there about that building and what happened in that military strike. But what other specifics, what other facts might you want to know as you analyze or as you think about this situation? If this image came on the news in front of you today, what questions might you ask? Go ahead to menti.com, enter that code 47372963 at the top of your screen, and we'll fill out another word bubble here. Just think of things. Doesn't need to be a full sentence. A word or two is perfectly fine. What might be important to know about that attack, the building, those involved? Sometimes it takes it a second to activate. I think we might have worn Menti out with that last excellent word bubble. If it doesn't kick into gear in a second here, we'll move on. Okay, well, batting 500 is excellent in the MLB, so we'll take it for that. Keep that in mind, the sort of things that you thought about when you saw this image and the questions that arose to you in spite of the basic facts that I gave you. Keep that in mind as we move through this presentation. So I want to start as we enter the substance of this portion by acknowledging what's happening in the headlines. Obviously, the armed conflict and war in Ukraine is dominating coverage across the board right now, and is thrust international humanitarian law back into the spotlight in terms of the global discourse. It's far from the only armed conflict that's raging around the globe today. It happens to be the one that has caught global attention. As many of you have seen, if you've been keeping up with the coverage of this war, or quite frankly, any armed conflict, facts develop, evidence develops, things change on a day-by-day basis, on an hour-by-hour basis sometimes. What is presented as fact in one instance at the beginning of the day may look very different as additional facts, as the situation evolves, and as more is understood about the scenario. That's happening in Ukraine. That has happened in countless armed conflicts throughout history, and it's just the nature of things. War is chaotic. You may have heard of the term the fog of war, and it's very real, right? The sense that what you may be seeing, there may be more to that picture, more to that video is ever present, and it's always true. So what we are not going to be doing in this presentation is conducting any detailed analysis of particular situations in the Ukraine armed conflict, in that war. Because quite frankly, those facts, that evidence is still being developed. And while terms like war crimes and situations, others out there in the sphere are analyzing imagery, videos that are rolling out from this war, the fact remains that a lot has to come out about what you're seeing. So it would be inappropriate for us to dive in any sort of definitive manner into situations, into attacks that are being seen and being developed as we speak. In fact, the ICC chief prosecutor, who's on the ground very recently in Kyiv, made comments that really echoed this principle, really echoed the fact that in his pursuit of justice, in his pursuit of facts and evidence, that he had come to no conclusions, that process was going to play out over quite some time and would involve a great deal of effort. He stopped short of coming to any conclusions about any specific incidents that have happened in the war, and made a very poignant point about the fact and the need for that sort of evidence gathering across the board. So we're going to touch instead on some core legal frameworks that will enable all of you to go forth and engage with what you're seeing, not just in Ukraine, but in any armed conflict, and have a better understanding of what's playing out, be able to filter fact from conjecture, be able to understand better these sort of things. Because at the end of the day, whether it's Ukraine or another armed conflict, there's not a month that goes by that IHL or an IHL issue isn't in the news, that it's not being talked about in schools, at the dinner table, in political circles. It is simply ever present. And the importance of understanding that legal framework has never been more important than it is today, as more and more members of the public engage with this sort of coverage and discuss the sort of issues that they're seeing play out. Before we dive into IHL proper, I think it's appropriate as a first step to frame and give a little explainer to the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. As you may have seen in this armed conflict or others, the Red Cross movement as a whole is playing a central role in the reduction of suffering across the board. And so I want to introduce you to my colleague, Larissa Hatch, who's going to speak to you about that overall framework and what that looks like in terms of an armed conflict such as the one that's unfolding on the news today. Larissa?
Great, thanks, Thomas. And again, we're starting with the movement because we really do have such an integral role, not only in times of armed conflict, but also disaster, and really whenever the need arises. And the intended vision and mission of this unified movement has really been based upon our founders, Clara Barton and Henry Dunant, and their legacies. So it's important to really evaluate what we're able to accomplish from what they wanted and had started. So of course, one event that is, as we said, are capturing the attention of really the world is the conflict occurring on the ground in Ukraine. And you'll see all three of these bodies of the movement work in concert together to achieve the mission of the movement. As you all highlighted in your Menti question, we're all driven by the same principles, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you're all right that we're driven by compassion, service, and the protection of human dignity. So starting with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, holds the priority of assisting those in need. You probably have seen them a lot in the media, on Twitter. There's a strong presence in theater and as well as in the news and media and things like that. And their main operations focus on ensuring the humanitarian protection and assistance for civilians and victims of armed conflict. So in their function, we can see the ICRC mobilizing to facilitate evacuations of civilians right now, assisting in maintaining the rights for POWs and detainees, and delivering essential items and medical supplies. When we move to the national societies, such as ourselves as the American Red Cross or the Malaysian Red Crescent, the role is to execute the unified mission of, and some of you I'm sure know this as the mission that we all agree on, is preventing and alleviating human suffering wherever there is need. And the national societies do that in their respective countries. There are 192 societies present, and they're present in just about every country in the world. So sometimes in international episodes, these national societies must work together to support those shared needs of those suffering across border lines. And then this is where the International Federation of the Red Cross, or the IFRC, really comes into play. And the Federation effectively facilitates the coordination of these national societies. They work to connect the resources of one national society to the needs of another, really acting as a global secretariat. And a relevant example is their role in liaison with host countries supporting refugees and displaced persons from armed conflict. So what we're seeing unfold in the Ukrainian conflict is the IFRC and the ICRC coordinating actively with the national societies on all sides of the conflict. So this does include the Ukrainian Red Cross, the Russian Red Cross, and other national societies. And this is common really in all conflicts. And we're going to delve a little bit into more about how we can do that as a neutral body. But again, it's really driven by the desire to serve the humanitarian needs of all of those affected by conflict. So while the three independent bodies live in kind of separate worlds, the movement is unified and works together to carry out the specific duties that support, again, this greater mission. And we're bound together by a shared set of what we call our humanitarian principles or fundamental principles. So we are guided by these fundamental principles, which really define the ethics and approach to serving those in times of need, including, of course, in armed conflict. And as a shared part of the movement's identity, the principles unite the bodies within the movement to ensure that there's effective, unbiased, and consistent assistance. The Red Cross was born on the battlefield, really with the desire to respond to the needs of wounded and to protect life, again, preventing human suffering wherever it's found. And that's why we start with the principle of humanity, which is really to ensure that there's respect for every human being and the preservation of their dignity, especially in times of war when all other rules are broken down. So really, humanity embodies our ethos in quite literally everything we do. Moving on to neutrality, the movement can never, like we said earlier, take sides in hostilities and controversies. This is in speech or action or even perception. And the movement's neutrality assures that all parties assisting, whether it's civilians, wounded, or those detained, does not constitute interference in the conflict. Again, meaning that there are no sides when it comes to serving the needs of those suffering. When we talk about independence, we are referring to how national societies remain autonomous. So these principles continue to reflect how they work hand in hand, but truly being independent from governments, but maintaining that we share the same principles, the movement is able to, again, move into places where there's theater and we might be the only ones present. And that kind of moves from neutrality, it connects us to impartiality, which really is guaranteeing that relief is given without discrimination and based solely on need, regardless specifically of nationality, race, public opinion, or any other classifier. Universality is really in reference to the equal status of all of our societies. So like I said earlier, with 192 national societies, we are a global network and we're responsible for respecting and adhering to the same principles and fundamental values. And this helps us in being able to respond to crises and supporting one another because we're all kind of moving in that same direction. Voluntary service is really at the heart of what we do, and the movement is grounded in voluntary participation. Nothing that we do is for personal gain or motive. Everything is only for the desire to serve and to help. And national societies, our volunteers are often the first one on the scene when disaster strikes. They remain active within affected communities long after everyone has left. And in some cases, they're the only organizations that are able to operate in countries experiencing disasters, conflicts, or like kind of we're seeing in sometimes real time, the collapse of social fabric. So through its volunteers, these national societies are rooted in their local communities, and it helps in understanding their specific needs. But then again, we're part of a greater network, so we're always kind of there to lean in when the need arises. And we kind of wrap up with unity, where it's really important to understand that while we are one Red Cross, one Red Crescent movement, there is only one national society in each country, and it must be open to all to serve and be served in order to carry out the humanitarian work throughout its territory. So these principles are really key, again, to the movement's identity. And while they hold true at all times, especially during wartime and civil unrest, these principles really uniquely position the Red Cross to be able to serve on the front lines as this neutral body and neutral party, helping to reduce suffering on, again, all sides of the conflict. So the Red Cross is able to operate in these conflict zones because of this unique posture. Again, you'll hear it be said constantly today in our presentation, but taking no sides and exclusively focusing on the humanitarian mission. Well, Thomas will get into this, but this really becomes vitally important when we're using the IHL framework, and it truthfully forms the underpinning and the movement's commitment to IHL and conflicts across the globe. So that's just a little bit about our history. I'm sure there's a lot of you on the call that are very familiar with our fundamental principles, but just kind of wanted to start there before we delve into IHL. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Larissa. So with that framework in mind, I want to start by addressing the big 50,000-foot view of international humanitarian law. It's a term that gets batted around quite a bit, but in practice, even those with legal training, lawyers that are out there practicing every day, don't necessarily have an understanding of what IHL is. It's, as you see here, at its core, a set of rules that is meant to rein in the destruction, the inherent destructiveness of war. For time immemorial, war has existed, and unfortunately, for far too long, alongside armed conflict came unchecked death, destruction, and injury, in oftentimes at the expense of the innocent and at the expense of innocent property as well. And with the advent of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and Henry Dunant and in our case, Clara Barton's efforts, they recognized, as did others around the globe, that this simply could not continue. That while war may never be stopped, that may be an aspirational goal, things could be done to rein in that destruction. Things could be done amongst the international community to come together and agree upon a set of rules by which countries, parties to a conflict could follow and reduce that destruction, and in turn protect those that are deserving of protection, that need protection the most when armed conflict erupts. At its core, at its heart, that is what IHL is. It's not a single statute. It's not a single case book that you'll find on a shelf. It's developed over the course of decades and has evolved as armed conflict has evolved and become more and more destructive. But at its core, it is a set of those rules that are meant to rein in that destructiveness. Within IHL, it's comprised of a lot of different components. As I said, it's not a single case book. You can't pull it off the shelf in one volume and read it all. There are individuals out there, professionals, academics that have devoted their entire profession to this field and are still learning every single day. I count myself among that. I learn stuff about this field every day, and it's what I do all the time. And I say that having a background as a military officer, an Army judge advocate who has practiced this law in a conflict zone in Afghanistan. What I know now compared to when I deployed is very, very different. But in terms of the broad brush, what you see is two key components that form IHL at its core. You have international treaties, so things like the Hague and Geneva Conventions. As you see there, those are a set of rules formalized between parties that are legally binding. Think of the sort of document that you can download, the book that you can pull off the shelf that has signatories. As you see here, a meeting concerning the Geneva Conventions from 1949 there in black and white. That forms one of the core bases for IHL. The other, and perhaps one that is a bit unique and a bit unfamiliar to many folks, is the idea of customary rules. This idea that over the course of years, over the course of conflicts, there are certain practices that are consistently followed by parties to armed conflicts, by states. Things that are done again and again and over the course of time are treated and accepted as binding law. Now, you're not going to find these customary rules codified necessarily in a treaty. They're not reduced to writing with signatures from those from different countries necessarily, but they have that same force. That customary international law is a wide body within IHL that forms some that provides some critical protections along the way. So when you think about IHL, really think about these two buckets with which these rules are coming from. Now, there has been a lot in especially recent headlines concerning the legality of armed conflict. And I want to make a distinction here, because there are two bodies of law that are in play when you talk about the legalities of going to war. So in other words, a state or an armed group using force against another state or another armed group. The Latin phrase, I did not do well. I took Latin in high school. You're not going to be able to know that from my butchering of Latin words in just a second. But jus ad bellum, that's the Latin term to describe the body of law, the legalities concerning the use of force, the right of a nation to use, or the circumstances by which they can use force, and in many cases, enter war. That's one bucket. The other bucket, jus in bello, is the set of rules that concerns how that conflict, how that war is actually conducted, the business of the means and methods of warfare. Now, the two are interlocked, understandably. They are both bodies of law concerning war at their core. But what I want to make very clear here is that a lack of legality in going to war. So by that I mean, if you lack a legal basis as a state for using force, for invading another country, that does not then mean that any actions taken within that subsequent armed conflict, within that war, are illegal. So there's not a straight line between the two. Just because you start up what might be considered an illegal armed conflict and a legal war, one that you didn't have a basis under that component of international law to start, doesn't mean that everything that your armed forces do or that everything that the combatants in that war do is illegal. That's treated separately under that body of law concerning the means and methods of warfare. And that's critical because that's playing out before us every single day currently. When we're going to talk for the rest of today, you could have an entire class on the jus ad bello, the body of law concerning the ability to go to war, the legalities there. We're not going to touch that today. What we are going to touch is the conduct of hostilities and the law and how IHL prescribes certain rules concerning the conduct of hostilities to rein in that destruction. And I want to start by turning to my colleague Christian to walk us through the importance of classifying armed conflicts, because at the end of the day, the term war gets batted around a lot. It's woven its way a long time ago into the public conscience, but armed conflicts are not all created equal. They are treated differently under the law based on individual circumstances, and Christian is going to walk us through that. Christian?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, and I'm glad you brought up the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, which is IHL, or International Humanitarian Law, because legal wars can still be fought unlawfully, and lawful start of war, the unlawful start of a war can also be done legally. So it's good to remember that there's two separate bodies of governing law there. And that kind of goes to my next point that, when situations of conflict exist, it's important you get the terminology correct on how to label it. Like if it's an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict, and it's important because that will give you even further guidance, especially with codified law like treaties, on which treaties do you look at, because not all treaties apply to the same situations. So in situations of a non-international armed conflict, you can look to Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, because it specifically says that it applies to conflicts of a non-international character, or you can look to Additional Protocol 2, because it also says that it applies to non-international armed conflicts. However, when we think about war in like a historical sense, if you're like me and you're really into World War II or major battles in history, you often see these international armed conflicts. And that's something that until recently has kind of been off the radar and how we viewed some things. And so an international armed conflict would be a state versus a state. So that's the simplest definition. And by state, I'm talking like a country versus a country. And these are recognized, countries or states. And the law that applies to that would be your 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 in its entirety. And then for those countries that have signed on to it and ratified it, that would be Additional Protocol 1. For the purposes of our context, I know that Thomas said we're not going to be talking about situations involving the current conflict in Europe, but both Ukraine and Russia are members to Additional Protocol 1. So that would be a source that you could look at if you were doing your own legal research on things. But before I pass it back to Thomas, let's talk about how an international armed conflict can exist. It can obviously exist if there's a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war. for one state to another. However, that's not always necessary. An international armed conflict can also exist by the announcement of one state that it considers itself at war with another, or through the commission of hostile acts employing military forces, for example, against another state's military forces. And this can be absent a declaration. So you don't necessarily need a declaration for something to be classified as an international armed conflict. And once it's classified as an international armed conflict, you know that you have your customary laws that are still governing, but also your textual bodies of law, such as the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which there are 4 for those of you unfamiliar with them, and then your Additional Protocol 1 of 1977. And I will drop this in the chat for people to go look at and peruse on their own. The ICRC has a lot of these documents available in a PDF format. So I'll pass it over to Thomas with that being said.
So that sets the table for us. And for the balance of our discussion here today, we're going to talk about some of the core fundamental principles of IHL. Think of these as the bedrock of IHL, principles that cut to the core aims that IHL is trying to achieve, the core protections that it is trying to deliver. Time and again, I would wager as you finish and consume this, what we're about to talk about here, you're going to see these principles play out as you go forth and engage in news stories and conversations about whether it's the Ukraine conflict or others. And as I said before, IHL situations, IHL issues are in the news almost every single day. Understanding these fundamental principles is like having a pair of glasses to put what you're seeing, what you're hearing about into focus. And while we're not going to get you ready to take the bar exam or be an IHL expert at the end of this presentation, what I hope to provide you with is a baseline legal framework that you can go forth with and better understand what you're seeing unfold in the news, and better engage with others who are talking about this, and quite frankly, help others understand what they're seeing. In other words, separate just conjecture and folks that are batting about terminology that has a specific meaning, that has technical meaning, without really understanding what it is, and therefore advance these discussions and really help others understand the protections that are offered here. When we discuss these principles, think about this compromise that exists across all of IHL and which underpins these principles. IHL does not operate to try to eliminate all civilian casualties or prevent the destruction of all civilian property. That would be an unrealistic goal, however admirable it is. IHL understands, and the framers, those that have been involved in the development of IHL and those who have implemented it on the ground and abided by it, understand that there is a compromise, that on one side you have humanitarian principles, those principles that Larissa touched on, or more generally, these ideals of trying to safeguard human life and reduce suffering. That's counterbalanced on the other side by the recognition that there is sometimes going to be military necessity. There are sometimes going to have to be military actions that result in outcomes that we don't like, outcomes that are tragic, outcomes that are unfortunate and are horrific to see. But that tragedy, while that tragedy, that horror is undeniable and unchanged in terms of how no matter what the law sees it, that doesn't necessarily mean that tragedy doesn't necessarily mean that it's an illegal act. And so what you have is a balancing act here between trying to develop a set of rules or implement a set of rules that come into play on the battlefield, that balance that military necessity with that need to preserve humanity. Military necessity is the first of the 4 principles that we're going to discuss today, and it's really in my opinion, the single most important, because at the end of the day, if there's no military necessity for an attack, if there's no military necessity for a particular action, you don't go forward. There is no reason to use that military force. The idea behind military necessity is that the world as a whole doesn't want destruction for destruction's sake. We have seen that in conflicts in the past. We unfortunately still continue to see that today. But military necessity operates to require that when military force is used, it has to be used to achieve a legitimate military purpose. Usually that involves reducing the enemy's fighting capability or eliminating, destroying the enemy in some fashion. And in practice, you see two arms of this, two components of military necessity that come into play. You need to have a justification, a valid, lawful justification, but you also have to have military necessity that's balanced by limits. Just because something is theoretically necessary doesn't mean that all other bets are off, that you can take any action simply because there is some theoretical military necessity. And I'll get to that in a moment. When we talk about justification, it means that military force must only be used to accomplish a legitimate battlefield purpose, not some cooked up scheme, not some pie in the sky idea or farcical concept, but a legitimate purpose. And by that typically looks like a legitimate military objective is going to be at the core of military necessity. So that begs the question, what is a legitimate military objective or a legitimate military target? Well, let's take these two images here. On the top left, we have a BMP fighting vehicle. And on the bottom right, we have a pair of Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jets. Think about what might make these legitimate military targets. I submit to you that both of these photos involve machines that have, by their very nature, only one purpose. They are designed to eliminate the enemy. They are designed to conduct warfare. While certainly you could have, you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger out there with an entire collection of tanks. You have folks around the globe who possess retired, decommissioned fighter jets like these that they use for non-military purposes. At their core, when we're talking about a conflict, a wartime scenario, objects like these, by their very nature, are used for military purposes and therefore would be legitimate military targets. Now, the images on the right here, I want you to soak those in and understand them for what they are. They are what they appear to be. It's a trio of bridges. You've got a train in that middle one, some civilian traffic down bottom, some civilian vessels going underneath the bridge, and it looks like some civilian traffic up on the top. These are civilian objects. I'll get to the presumption that comes into play with objects like this in a moment. But at its core, these are civilian objects. So is there a way that these could be legitimate military targets? Well, let me add in the additional fact that these three images are key bridges into the city of Kyiv. Now, you can imagine that based on that location, the location of these three bridges, you can see why parties to a conflict might consider those bridges that are ordinarily civilian objects to be legitimate military targets. One side to a conflict might see those bridges as an access point for the enemy that needs to be denied. The other side to the conflict might see those bridges as a critical means of ingress and egress, or a critical means of escape for their opponents. So very different than if these three bridges were somewhere where a conflict wasn't occurring, in the middle of Pennsylvania or something like that. The analysis might be very different, but that location is key because it can shape and transform something that ordinarily would have that civilian protection and turn it into a legitimate military target. Now, what about this image? This is a nice BMW Convertible. again, presumed civilian. There's nothing about this car in this picture that makes it a military target, right? It appears to be a civilian in the car there, although we can only see a little bit of him. But what if I showed you this vehicle modified in a certain way with a heavy machine gun mounted on the back? What if if you were to watch a video of this vehicle, it's out there firing that machine gun and engaging, being used for military purposes? So this would be an example of where an object, again, a civilian object, this car, by its use, could be a legitimate military target. So the decision to mount a machine gun onto the back of the car and then use that machine gun for military purposes could transform that vehicle into a legitimate military target if the circumstances were right. So once again, much like those bridges and the idea that location can come into play, use comes into play as well. And I would reference you back, if you're familiar with World War II or you've seen the movie Dunkirk, think about those civilian vessels that answered the England's call and rowed across the English Channel to help evacuate British troops from the shores at Dunkirk as the German army closed in. Those civilian vessels, again, were a lot like this convertible, but as they were used to ferry out British troops in that instance, that use arguably turned them into legitimate military targets. So all of that comprises the justification arm that I discussed at the outset. But inherent and tied right along with that justification is the idea that there are limits to military necessity. The idea that the existence of military necessity doesn't allow a military or a commander to make actions that are unchecked by the law. So by that I mean actions that are militarily necessary cannot do something that is otherwise outlawed under international humanitarian law. So you can't color outside the lines and use military necessity to justify something that's otherwise unlawful. The tragic image here, for those of you who are World War II scholars or have read about World War II, this is the Malmedy massacre. This is a number of Allied troops, dozens of US troops who had fallen into German hands. It was a convoy that got lost, a logistics convoy. They were captured by Nazi forces. And the Nazi commanders, as the Allies broke through in the Battle of the Bulge, executed these Allied soldiers. And the argument from the German end was that it was militarily necessary to do that they could not afford to take these prisoners because of time constraints, because of their inability to handle these prisoners. They had no choice, the commander had no choice but to order their execution. That's not lawful. Despite that arguable or that argument surrounding necessity, clearly unlawful to kill prisoners in that instance, and one doesn't follow the other. The next principle that we'll touch on here is that of distinction, and this is one of the most important concepts that's out there in warfare, one that gets discussed in non-legal terms, and one that's important to understand the components of when you go forth and consider events in the news, situations in Ukraine and other places that are happening. So all parties to a conflict have an obligation. They must distinguish between civilians and combatants. Civilians under IHL have a protected status. They are not to be intentionally targeted. Again, that's not to say that civilians can't be killed in combat. That's not what distinction means. It doesn't outlaw the death of a civilian or a military operation where a civilian may be injured or killed, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But you have to distinguish, and you cannot intentionally target those who are not combatants. You also have to, much like you have to distinguish between people, you also have to distinguish between objects, those that are military and those that are civilian. And we touched on that just briefly in the talk about necessity, and I'll explain that more in a second. So for combatants, this is an easy distinction. So they have an obligation to distinguish themselves from the civilian population. when engaged in an attack. Certainly, the lines there have been blurred in recent conflicts around the globe, where insurgencies or other belligerents have used the civilian populace to mask themselves. And the core of the requirement here is the idea that we don't want combatants to abuse or try to use that protected civilian status in order to conduct combat. That puts other civilians at risk. That dangerously blurs the line and makes it very, very difficult for other belligerents in an armed conflict to conduct that distinguishing set of analysis. So when you talk about a uniformed soldier from a country, say a US soldier, that's typically an easy thing to do. We wear uniforms, we wear distinctive insignia, but in situations around the globe, you often have those who aren't uniformed soldiers, but who take up arms through various means. They still have an obligation if they are conducting or if they are engaged in hostilities, they have to distinguish themselves. Whether that's a member of a territorial defense force, such as the image here wearing a yellow armband, that goes back to that same requirement. The carrying of arms openly is another factor in there, but that's an obligation there that is built not to inconvenience someone or inconvenience an army or inhibit their ability to conduct military operations, but it's done to protect those who are innocent. There are also non-combatants that may be in uniform, things like medics, things like chaplains who don't have a combat function, but serve an important role on the battlefield. Non-combatants, as they're called, cannot be intentionally targeted. So when you think about things like a medical evacuation, a medevac helicopter, an ambulance, these things are not to be targeted. They're protected under international humanitarian law. Again, they can be, that doesn't say that they can't be destroyed in an attack. That it's not a broad brush illegality that's established, but it's the intentionality that IHL seeks to touch on there. We also have distinction in civilian objects, and to go back to my earlier point, all objects are considered civilian objects unless they are distinctly military objectives. So you might have an object such as this one, a radio tower that's normally used for civilian purposes, but which can become a military objective through its use. So perhaps this radio tower is being used by an army to communicate, to coordinate military operations. That might then present a military advantage for an adversary to destroy that tower and deny that the opponent that communication advantage. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Christian, who's going to walk us through the last two principles.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I know there's some questions in the Q&A, and so I will go as relatively quick as I can with getting these concepts across. Specifically this one, which I find is to be very important, and it's one of the more subjective principles when you view it from outside of a decision-making role within the military, and that's the principle of proportionality. It's one of the fundamental goals that's been discussed this whole time about international humanitarian law is the protection of civilians, civilian objects, basically the innocent, that could be, wounded soldiers, etc., from the ravages of war. And so IHL really seeks to minimize incidental civilian casualties and destruction of civilian objects. But I want to just highlight that I said it to minimize. It doesn't prohibit. There's a prohibition of intentional civilian, casualties, et cetera. But it recognizes, the law recognizes the reality of the situation that we're in and recognizes that collateral damage will occur. So it's not a prohibition, but it does work to minimize the loss of civilian life and civilian objects. And that's the principle of proportionality in a nutshell. You have to balance that military necessity that Thomas talked about earlier with the spirit of IHL, to protect the innocent and minimize suffering during war. I think I put in the chat a article from Additional Protocol 1. That's Article 51.5, which kind of demonstrates a legal definition of this principle And it says that an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss to civilian life, injury to civilian objects, or a combination of that, which it would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated is not allowed, is prohibited, for example. So it can't be, the loss of civilian life and civilian objects can't be excessive to the military advantage gained, just like the definition on the screen says. But notice that, excessiveness doesn't necessarily, is kind of subjective, right? And to be frank, like this isn't a there's no numerical cutoff mark that says, oh, you violated proportionality because X occurred. Now, you might have something in your own internal documents that guides you, but that's not necessarily violating the principle of proportionality. So how we have to look at the principle of proportionality is through the lens of the people making these types of determinations. And those are going to be military commanders who make operating decisions. And so we need to trust the people making these decisions and respect this principle and its relationship to the law, because it's kind of a reasonable commander test when you're kind of analyzing it through your own lens, your own viewpoint. So it's similar to the reasonable person test for you. Those of you who have gone through law school, when you determine that someone breached their duty, or would a reasonable person have acted the same way? But you would view it that way. Like, would a reasonable commander with the information available to them have made the same determination on what is proportional or not? And it's often difficult for people like me who haven't been in those situations to make those determinations, because I'm always working in hindsight. But I also need to recognize that I don't have full information usually, because information that is involved with making, targeting decisions or military operational decisions is not usually public, So we need to recognize that, and just remember that this principle exists for a reason, and that it does its best to minimize it, and that it's always a test of would a reasonable commander have made that same decision under the circumstances. Thomas, you can go to the next slide. So the next slide is means and methods of warfare and the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering. So IHL does prohibit or regulate certain means, which would be the weapons, and it can prohibit some type of methods from being used in warfare, and that anything else must comply with the principles of IHL. So Thomas, you want to go to the next slide for me? And one of the principles of IHL that we haven't discussed is this principle of humanity, also called the limiting unnecessary suffering principle, that you can't use whatever means or methods that are designed or intended to just cause unnecessary suffering or destruction for the purposes of just causing that unnecessary suffering or destruction. For example, if an enemy soldier is out of the fight by being wounded, for example, or say that they're captured, continuing to attack that person really serves no military purpose. So that would be, a violation of the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering to just target that person who's clearly not a part of the fight anyways. You can also think about it from a weapons standpoint, like certain asphyxiating gases are prohibited because, there's other means out there that would serve less, result in less destruction or get the same job done basically at that point. And when you think about this principle and you're watching the news and you're hearing things about Molotov cocktails, or even you're reading a book about wars in Southeast Asia, about flamethrowers, it might get you thinking like, what about those means and methods of warfare? Like, are those prohibited? Or and most of the time when you do the research, which I always encourage people to do, like look at the law. What does the law actually say when you're hearing stuff in the news? It might prohibit it in certain weapons from being used in certain circumstances, and then regulate, like it's more of a regulatory weapon. Like for flamethrowers, for example, there's no outright ban on them, but no one would deny that the suffering caused by that is pretty extreme. So maybe Molotov cocktails or other incendiary devices our weapons would have the same regulatory effect. But we need to keep the limiting unnecessary suffering principle in mind whenever we hear about military operations, and frankly, applying it to the facts as they come in. All right, I'll pass it over to Thomas, I believe, unless I have one more slide, but I want to make sure we get to questions, should there be any.
Yeah,
this is actually a pretty important slide. I always get this question is, does IHL allow for mistakes to occur? And it kind of goes back to my discussion on the principle of proportionality, recognizing that very unfortunate things and horrific things are going to happen in war. And sometimes those things are going to be unintentional. And we also have to recognize the nature and the environment in which armed conflict is occurring, where the people making decisions are often under time constraints, high stress level, and tired, working with incomplete information, and recognizing that although these decisions mean life or death, it's not always the person making the decision. It also could be about protecting their own soldiers and their own troops at the same time, or their own community, or whatever the situation is. And so we have to recognize that all these decisions come down to an individual judgment, and individuals are not always 100% perfect. So IHL does allow for mistakes to occur, but that's also just a consequence of conflict in general. So now I'll pass it over to Thomas.
Thanks, Christian. There's no strict liability in IHL. It recognizes all the things that Christian just talked about. So it's not an if-then. If a principle or a law within IHL has been violated, then there is liability and you've committed a war crime. It doesn't function as that sort of light switch. There's a lot of, as you can see here on this slide, it's a scale, and it's a scale that varies from situation to situation. And this undergirds my point at the outset about as you consume and watch events unfold in Ukraine and elsewhere on the news, understand that this is in play for those on all sides of the conflict. And that's why it's critical to allow evidence and facts to develop, and just understand that it's not a strict liability system. I don't know that we'll have time for questions, but I want to encourage you. We're going to have our contact information on the back end, and I want you to reach out. I apologize for we don't want to run over time, but reach out. We're happy to engage. Our whole purpose, our existence is based in the need, and quite frankly, under the Geneva Conventions, the requirement for public engagement about IHL, to do just what we've done here, to help educate, to help inform lawyers, non-lawyers, just people in the public about IHL and the importance of those protections. So I want to encourage you, don't settle for not having your question answered here. Reach out to one of us. I want to encourage you to stay tuned for other programming by our IHL team. We don't always run events just like this. A lot of times we use a variety of means to teach these things. These are just 3 examples. We've gotten into the pop culture realm, where we'll use different things like Harry Potter, Star Wars, to teach IHL concepts in a different light. I want to encourage you to get involved with our IHL programs. We exist, and the vast majority of our work is done by volunteers, many of whom are just like you. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to have a bar license. You don't have to have experience in IHL. You don't have to have served in uniform. You just have to have a passion for this field, and a willingness and a desire to engage with the public and do just what we're doing here. So whether it's our adult dissemination program, which is something that this kind of programming would fall under, or a youth action campaign where youth, young advocates aged 13 to 24 are out there engaging their peers and their communities about IHL issues, there's room under our tent for everyone. And in many cases, we provide you with the training. You don't need to come fully stocked with that legal knowledge. We get you up to speed, and then you go forth and help out with the work. We also have fellowships at the national headquarters level. I have the 2 year-long fellowships posted here. If you're interested in an IHL fellowship with the national headquarters team, please reach out and get in touch with one of us. And as I promised, and I would ask one of our teammates to put these into the chat, please stay in touch. If you've never engaged with the IHL team, if you've never engaged at the local level with an IHL or YAC program, don't be a stranger. Reach out. These are issues that are global in their impact, and we have a vast and very talented team of volunteers, of staff across the country, across the globe, who are all lockstep in trying to do this same sort of work. And we would love to have you on our bench. We would love to welcome you onto the IHL team. On behalf of the entire American Red Cross and the IHL program at national headquarters, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again at a program in the future. Thank you very much.